Hey everyone, and welcome to our deep dive. We're going to get into something really interesting today. It's delimitation in India, and I know it might sound kind of dry, like something out of a textbook, but trust me, this is about way more than just geography. We're talking about political power, who gets a voice, and who gets to make the big decisions.
You hit the nail on the head there. It's not just about drawing lines on a map. It's about the very foundation of representation in a democracy.
Right. So maybe we should start by breaking it down for folks who might not be totally familiar with this. Delimitation. It's basically just redrawing the boundaries of those electoral districts.
Yeah, that's the simple explanation. But what makes it really interesting in India is that the way seats are allocated in their parliament, like in the Lok Sabha, is actually still based on the census from 1971.
Wow, 1971. That's over 50 years ago. I mean, think about how much India's population has changed since then. Why haven't they updated the system to reflect that?
Well, back then there was a concern that states with rapidly growing populations would end up with too much power. So they put a freeze on how those seats were allocated. That freeze got extended a few times, and now it's set to expire in 2026.
2026. That's not too far off. So what happens then? Like if they actually do reallocate those seats based on the current population?
When things get interesting, let's just say some states are in for a pretty big shakeup.
Okay, I definitely want to hear more about this shakeup. But first I have to ask, what happens to different states if they go through with this reallocation?
Well, some states, particularly in the south, like Tamil Nadu and Kerala, could actually end up losing seats. Their populations haven't grown as fast as other states. And if they're going purely based on population, that means they'll have less representation in parliament.
Hold on. So are we saying they're being penalized for managing their population growth? What's the logic there?
It's a debate with really strong arguments on both sides. You know, the states with bigger populations, they argue that they deserve more seats just because they have more people. It's kind of a basic idea of democracy, right? Majority rules.
Yeah, I could see that. Power to the people and all that. But what about the states that are set to lose seats? What are they saying?
They're bringing up a really important point. They're asking, shouldn't things like how much a state contributes to the economy, the quality of their governance, even their social development, shouldn't all that matter too? They're saying, hey, we might not have the biggest population, but we're doing a lot to contribute to the nation's well-being.
It's like saying don't just count heads, look at what those heads are actually doing.
Yeah.
It becomes about a lot more than just raw numbers then.
Exactly. And this gets to the heart of what political power actually means. If a state is contributing a lot to the national GDP but then loses seats in parliament, they suddenly have less influence, less say in how those funds are distributed or what policies get prioritized.
Right? That makes a lot of sense. It's not some abstract political game. We're talking about real world stuff. Resources development, the actual lives of people.
Absolutely.
I'm starting to see why this is such a big deal. You know, when I was doing a little reading on this, I came across something called a pro rata solution that some people have been talking about. What is that all about?
The pro rata idea is interesting. It's basically trying to find some middle ground in all of this. They want to adjust how those seats are allocated, but not just based on the total population. They also want to look at things like how densely populated a state is and how well it's governed.
So it's like they're acknowledging that a city packed with millions of people might need different things compared to a more rural area.
Right. It's adding some nuance to the equation. It's not just about how many people live somewhere, but also how they're spread out and how well the government is serving them.
So is pro rata the magic solution then? Does it fix everything?
It's a good idea, but like with any potential solution, there are some challenges. How do you actually measure something like good governance? What are the criteria? And who gets to make that call?
So it's not quite as straightforward as it might seem.
Nope. But the fact that people are even having these conversations shows how important this issue is. It's not just some political maneuvering. They're really trying to create a system that's fair and represents everyone in a country as big and diverse as India.
Well, it sounds like there's a lot to unpack here, and I'm definitely ready to dig in deeper. You ready to keep going?
Let's do it.
All right, so we've talked about how this delimitation thing is more than just moving lines around on a map. It's really about who has the power, who gets the resources, and ultimately whose voices are heard in the government. But what I'm wondering is how realistic is this pro rata solution? Do you think there's actually support for making such a big change?
It's a really complicated issue, you know, and there are no easy answers. The pro rata approach has definitely gained some traction, especially among those who feel like the current system punishes states that have done a good job managing their population.
Yeah, I could see why they'd be pushing for that. It does seem like a more balanced way to approach things than just looking at the total number of people.
It tries to look at the bigger picture, like how densely populated an area is and how well the government is actually functioning. But there are arguments against it too, of course.
Like what? What are some of the challenges with putting a pro rata system into place?
Well, one of the biggest hurdles is how do you measure something as complicated as good governance? Like, what are the standards? Who gets to decide what good even means?
Hmm, that's a really good point. Sounds like I could open up a whole other can of worms.
It could. It could become really subjective and potentially even lead to manipulation. And then there's the question of whether the politicians themselves actually want to change things. Those in power, they might not be so keen on changing a system that's working in their favor.
Right, human nature, I guess. But it makes me wonder, what happens if they just can't agree? What if they can't find a compromise?
Well, that's a scary thought for a lot of people. If the government just goes ahead and does delimitation based on the latest census without considering these fairness issues, it could cause some serious problems.
Like what kind of problem?
It could create a lot of instability, more division between different parts of the country.
This is starting to sound pretty serious.
It is. The decisions they make over the next few years are going to have a huge impact on India's democracy.
So what can be done? What are some ways forward that could lead to a better outcome?
Well, they need to keep talking. Try to build some kind of consensus around a more fair way to approach delimitation. Maybe they can come up with a version of the pro rata system that addresses those concerns about being too subjective or open to manipulation.
But that would take a lot of cooperation. Everyone would have to be willing to compromise.
Yeah. It would require those in power to really think about the long-term health of the country and not just their own political careers. Put the common good first.
That's a big ask. But hopefully they'll realize how important this is. Are there any other options on the table?
They could always delay the process again, buy themselves a bit more time to figure things out.
So just hit the snooze button. Would that actually solve anything?
It's not a perfect solution, but it could give them some breathing room to work through these complicated issues and hopefully come up with a better plan.
I guess kicking the can down the road isn't ideal, but in this case it might be better than rushing into something that could backfire.
Something that often gets overlooked in these discussions is the role of the public.
Oh yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
This isn't just some political game happening behind closed doors. It affects everyone.
Exactly. The more people know about this and the more they speak up, the more pressure there will be on the government to find a solution that actually works for everyone.
So it's not just about watching what happens. It's about being an active citizen.
Right. It's about recognizing that democracy is a team effort. It requires participation from everyone. It requires people being informed and engaged and holding those in power accountable.
I like that. A reminder that we all have a part to play in this.
We do. In a way, this whole delimitation situation, it's not just a problem, it's an opportunity.
An opportunity. How so?
It's a chance for India to take a hard look at some of the foundations of its democracy, to have a real conversation about what representation really means. And it might even lead to new solutions that could serve as a model for other countries facing similar challenges.
That's an interesting way to look at it. Turning a potential crisis into something positive.
Exactly. It's a time that requires both caution and courage, a willingness to tackle tough questions, and a real commitment to finding solutions that uphold the values of fairness and democracy.
I think you really summed it up there.
Huh.
It's about so much more than just lines on a map or seats in Parliament.
It is. But let's bring it back down to earth for a second. I think it's important to think about what this actually means for the average person.
That's a really important point. We can get lost in the big picture stuff, but at the end of the day, this is about people's lives.
And that's where it gets interesting, because depending on how this all shakes out, it could have a huge impact on every aspect of life in India.
All right, so we're back, and I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into this whole delimitation situation in India. We've talked about the history and some of the challenges and even some potential solutions. But before we go, I want to bring this back to you, our listener. You told us that you live in listener's state, right?
Right. And as we've been discussing, your state is one of those that could actually lose seats in the Lok Sabha if they base delimitation just on the latest population numbers.
And you mentioned that you're worried about what that could mean for your state's influence in the government, especially when it comes to things like how resources are allocated.
And those are valid concerns. Listener state has contributed a lot to the national economy, and losing seats in parliament could mean having less say in how things are run.
So let's break that down a bit. What could this actually look like for you and your community if listener state loses some of its political power?
Well, one area where you might see a difference is in infrastructure. Think about the funding for things like new roads, bridges, or public transportation. With fewer MPs representing your state in parliament, it could become harder to get the money for those projects.
And those infrastructure projects, they affect so much. You know, everything from the economy to how easy it is for people to get around. It's not just about building stuff, it's about connecting communities and creating opportunities.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just infrastructure. Think about education and healthcare, funding for schools, hospitals, research. All of that could be affected. Your state might have to fight harder for a smaller piece of the pie, which could impact the quality of those services for you and your family.
So this isn't just theoretical. We're talking about things that could impact your kids' schools, the healthcare, your parents have access to, even job opportunities. It really brings it home, doesn't it?
It does. It shows how this debate about delimitation isn't just some abstract political thing. It has the potential to really affect people's lives.
But it's not all bad news, right? We also talked about some potential solutions that could help make the system more fair.
Oh, definitely. Like that pro rata system we discussed.
Yeah.
That tries to take into account more than just population size. It considers things like population density and how well the government is functioning. The goal is to make sure that states like yours that have done a good job and contributed a lot aren't unfairly penalized.
So there's still a chance they could come up with a more balanced system. But like we said, it's going to require some real conversations, some compromises, and a commitment to what's best for the country in the long run.
Exactly. And this is where you as a citizen have a really important role to play. Stay informed about what's happening. Talk to your elected officials. Make your voice heard. And hold them accountable for creating a system that works for everyone in India.
Yeah, this isn't just about watching the news. It's about being an active participant in shaping the future of your country.
And remember, democracy, it's not a spectator sport. It needs everyone to be involved. The more informed and engaged people are, the better their democracy will be.
Well said. I think that's a great place to leave it. Delimitation is a complex issue, but it's also a chance for India to really demonstrate its commitment to fairness and equality. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope you found it helpful and maybe even a little inspiring.